Hey there, welcome to another episode of WeighOut Wednesday. My name is Dr. Ashley Southard. I'm joining you from Scottsdale, Arizona with a New Beginning Outpatient Treatment Center and the Healthy Way Out Emotional and Binge Eating Weight Loss Program. Now, this month I am dedicating all of these episodes to talking about a very important but sensitive topic, and that is the connection between binge eating disorder and childhood sexual abuse. Now, just a friendly reminder, this is very mature content, so if you have little ears nearby, please make sure that they're not able to hear this. Also, before moving forward, please check in with yourself. Make sure that this is content that you feel emotionally prepared to hear. If you feel like it might be helpful to have someone with you while you're listening to this, please pause until you're able to have that person with you. I definitely want to make sure that you're able to take this in a way that's helpful for you. Okay, so let's jump in and talk a little bit more about binge eating disorder and childhood sexual abuse. Now, last week I gave some very sobering statistics about the very high correlation between these two issues, with research suggesting that more than half of people struggling with binge eating disorder and related weight issues actually have this experience in their past history. So it's very, very sad. So, today I want to connect the dots a little bit more and talk about how this early life experience can actually influence and show up in your adult life today. In order to do that, though, I have to go back in time and we have to spend a few minutes talking about the experience of childhood sexual abuse so that we can then understand how it affects someone in their adult life. Now, as you can imagine, the experience of childhood sexual abuse is incredibly confusing for a young child. Now, remember, sexual abuse can include any kind of sexual touch or exposure to something that's sexually inappropriate. This is something that is done by an adult. It's something that is unwanted, non consensual. So, this could be intercourse, touch, or being forced to watch something that is sexual in nature. So, any of these experiences often leave a child in complete confusion, and there's a lot of different reasons why that happens. For most children, this is a very, very unpleasant and unwanted experience. While it's happening, they have this sense that this is bad. I don't want this to be happening right now. This is a very negative and bad touching experience. However, unfortunately, for a lot of the adults that I work with, what they will also say is this was actually the only kind of human touch they were getting at all. Okay, so it's very negative, bad, unwanted touch, and yet it was the only touch. And so, in some ways, it kind of felt good from an emotional perspective because the warmth of another human body next to them did feel good, but it came at a very high price tag. So that can certainly set into motion a lot of confusion, right? Here's this young child is experiencing bad touch, but also noticing a part of themselves enjoying the fact that there's somebody next to them. All right. Another way in which this experience can be incredibly confusing is it's very, very scary for a child, right? This oftentimes happens either at night in the dark and or when the child is alone with the perpetrator. So here's again this bad, unwanted thing happening to them. It may be really dark, they may be all alone, it's very scary, and they feel very unsafe. But here's the confusing part. Most childhood sexual abuse perpetrators are people that a child knows. This could be a parent, a sibling, a family member, a neighbor, a friend down the street, a babysitter. It's oftentimes someone the child knows, someone the child trusts, and maybe even someone the child loves. So, again, here's this really bad, scary thing happening, and yet it's happening with someone that the child loves, that the child trusts. That's really confusing. Why would this good person do such a bad thing? Okay, this is the type of thought process that a young child is going to have as the result of going through this abuse. Now, here's another confusing element. Childhood sexual abuse oftentimes can be very painful for a child, okay? From a physical standpoint, this is very painful. And yet, the human body is wired at birth to feel sexual pleasure. So even young children can be sexually stimulated. That's how the human body is wired. So again, here is a very confusing experience. It's painful, and yet they're noticing that there are some aspects of their body that are responding with pleasure. How can that be? Now, a young child doesn't understand what sexual pleasure is all about, and they certainly don't understand that their body is designed to do this. So, again, it becomes very, very confusing. Why is this hurting and maybe feeling good at the same time? All right. And one other piece here that can be very confusing is again back to this element of fear and the child being so scared while this is happening. Of course, they're going to want protection, right? They're going to want a parent to come in and rescue them. They're going to want a big brother or a big sister to know what's going on and save them from the perpetrator. And so they feel very vulnerable and unprotected. But here's the kicker: perpetrators are really, really good at messing with a child's head and making it so that the child continues to trust the perpetrator and not say anything about the abuse. So, even though one part of the child is wanting to get the heck away from this person and garner some protection from another adult or an older sibling around them, they're also being told by the perpetrator some type of threat or some type of positive thing that will happen if they stay quiet. So it's not uncommon for perpetrators to say, if you don't say anything to anybody, then I will love you, or I'll take you to the ice cream store. On the flip side, they might say, if you tell anybody about our special relationship, then I'm going to go to jail forever and that would ruin my life. Okay. Sometimes perpetrators will tell children that something really good will happen if they continue to allow this abuse to continue. So it might be, if you continue to lay here quietly with me, then, X, Y, and Z will happen. And they entice the child to think that they actually want this to go on so that the good thing will happen or the bad thing will be avoided. So, very, very confusing. This is very manipulative and psychologically abusive on the perpetrator's part. But again, a young child is too immature from an emotional and cognitive development perspective to understand any of this that's going on. So, what's left is this child who is so vulnerable, so innocent and naive, going through this incredibly confusing experience where their body is being hurt and taken advantage of. But they're noticing that sometimes there might be a little bit of pleasure that comes from that experience. They're with someone that they love, that they trust, that they know. And they're being told that something good will happen if they continue this, or something bad will be avoided if they continue this. So, this is very, very confusing. And a lot of things will then happen as a result of this internalized confusion that we then start to see showing up in adulthood. Now, there are a lot of different ways in which early childhood sexual abuse can affect a child's emotional and psychological development. And I don't have time to get into all of those today, but I want to talk about two key aspects that are very, very important in our ability to then understand how this experience can set the stage for the later development of binge eating disorder. Now, the first element that I want to talk about is the development of shame. And if you are someone who struggles with binge eating disorder, my sense is you are all too familiar with the feeling of shame. It is a very deep rooted negative sense of self that you are somehow unworthy, bad, defective, and flawed. Now, where does this come from and how does this relate to childhood sexual abuse? Well, when a child is being abused as a young person, this is happening during a very crucial developmental stage. And there's something that we know about child development in terms of how they understand the world and what's happening to them and around them. And it's called egocentric thinking. And basically, what it means is that a child experiences the world as, good things happening because the child is good and bad things happening because the child is bad. So everything centers around the child's ego, hence the term egocentric thinking. Now, as you can imagine, this can be a really positive aspect of a child's development and understanding of the world if they are in a safe and nurturing environment. They are being treated well because they're good, right? That's what an egocentric child will believe. But unfortunately, this gets used against the child's development when they are not in a safe, nurturing environment, and instead something like childhood sexual abuse is happening. Now, as I previously mentioned, this is a very negative and confusing experience for a child. This is a bad experience, to use very simple childlike language. So, with the concept of egocentric thinking, what we know then is if this child is having a bad experience, it's unfortunately going to be because they are bad. This is the very erroneous conclusion that children draw about themselves when they are going through something like sexual abuse. Okay, so here they are having this very bad, negative, unwanted experience, and it's happening with someone who typically the child knows, the child trusts, the child loves. So the child is looking at this adult abuser and saying, well, you're a good person, I think, so it seems, and yet this bad thing is happening. So if you're good, then the only reasonable conclusion that an egocentric child can draw is this abuse is happening because the child is bad. So their sense of self gets set into motion that they are bad, they are flawed, they are unworthy, they are defective. And these are all different words for this felt sense that they are somehow shameful. Okay? Now, to make matters even worse for the development of shame, if the child is told to not tell anyone about this abuse, then that actually accentuates the shame even more because now this very negative experience is being held inside and it's a secret. And we know that shame thrives in secrecy and isolation. So the more you hold this negative story inside, then the more shame the child starts to feel. Okay, so this experience of childhood sexual abuse is simply a breeding ground for the development of shame and this feeling of badness and unworthiness. Now, the other piece that I want to talk about with respect to a child's experience of sexual abuse is the element of dissociation, which is really just a fancy term for a disconnection between the mind and the body. Okay, and there's lots of degrees with which people dissociate. We all mildly dissociate sometimes. You hear about like the highway hypnosis, where you're driving and you get to your destination and you don't really recall driving and making every turn to get there. So, you're kind of on autopilot. Your mind is thinking about other things. That's a very mild form of dissociation. And then we have very extreme forms of dissociation where we see dissociative identity disorder. Very complex PTSD can come with dissociation. But really, what we're talking about here is this disconnection between the mind and the body. Okay, and this actually is a very powerful coping tool that a child will subconsciously begin to do as a way to cope with the confusion and the overwhelm that they feel in response to the sexual abuse. Now, most children who are experiencing the abuse will actually experience dissociation right there in the moment. And if you think about it, that's quite brilliant of the human psyche, right? It's a way to feel like you're leaving the situation, to not have to feel what's actually going on in your body. So it becomes a coping tool. And then unfortunately, the child begins to use that coping tool anytime emotions come up, or body sensations come up that are unpleasant, or maybe they see the perpetrator, or somebody starts talking about abuse. Then the child, and then later the adult, will actually start to dissociate, where they disconnect how they're thinking and how they're feeling in their body. Okay, so they stay very detached. These tend to be children and later adults who stay in their head a lot. They tend to be very logical and rational. They tend to not feel a lot of their emotions or body sensations. And when those emotions and body sensations start to bubble up, the child then has to find a way to stuff them back down. You're maybe starting to hear my language that I've used in previous episodes. What is one way in which a child may start to stuff down their emotions and their body sensations that they want to stay disconnected from? Well, as I've mentioned in previous videos, food is a developmentally appropriate drug of choice. All right, it's the drug that's available to a child when they're feeling all of these tough feelings, when they're feeling all of these very overwhelming body sensations. Food can become a way to stuff all that back down and maybe even to provide some soothing. So we are now starting to open the door to understanding how binge eating disorder then develops from the experience of childhood sexual abuse. So once this child grows up, there is a subconscious reenacting, if you will, of the shame and the dissociation. Okay? So this child has grown into adult who believes that they are bad. So there is this inherent belief in this adult that they are bad, that they are flawed and unworthy, and that they are shameful. Okay? And unfortunately, what then develops from that place is a very judgmental and critical relationship with oneself, where you may talk really negatively to yourself. You may criticize your emotions. You may think that you're just being such a baby or a wuss. What's wrong with me that I'm feeling this way? You may be really critical of your body, nitpicking every little thing that's wrong with it and having a really hard time noticing what your body does well. And then you may also notice the dissociation, where you're just really disconnected from your head to your heart, or your mind to your body. So this shame and this dissociation that you felt as a child as a result of something bad happening to your body then continues to show up in your adult life as shame and dissociation in relation to something bad happening to your body. And the bad thing happening to your body now is not the sexual abuse, it's now the binge eating disorder, right? Your body is continuing to be hurt and really abused, if you will, by the food that you're eating, and the quantity of the food that you're eating, and the way in which you're eating it. And when you go through that binge eating, you experience immense amounts of shame and disgust and dissociation, right? My guess is you're very disconnected between your mind and your body when you're going through the binge eating. You're not able to notice what's happening in your body. You're not able to notice hunger and fullness. You're not able to notice what you're feeling. And if you don't notice what you're feeling, then you certainly can't identify what you're needing to feel better, right? So then the food becomes kind of this catch-all, or this blanket for meeting any kind of distress that you feel. Yet the problem, as you know, with the binge eating is when you're done, it leaves behind a huge trail of shame and disgust, right? So you were feeling it before. You use the food as a way to try to quell that feeling a little bit, But once you're done, you have even more shame than when you started. So then maybe you promise yourself you're never going to do that again. You've got to get this under control. Maybe you start looking for a new diet, or you actually start a new diet. You think of an exercise plan that you're going to follow, and you think that the food is the problem and you're going to get yourself out of this nasty cycle. But then you get triggered again at some point, hours later, or the next day, or the next week, in which you're feeling ashamed and you're dissociated again. And when you're in that dissociative state and you're feeling all of the shame, you turn to the food as a way to help you feel better. It brings more shame, and round and round and round you go. Okay, so that's how we start to see the shame and the dissociation that develops from the abuse continue to play out in your relationship with food. All right. So I'm hoping that this is resonating with you and that that's starting to make sense with what happened to you as a child is now showing up in a slightly different form as an adult, but it's all very connected. Now, for most adults, this is a very subconscious process. And what we mean by that is this isn't something you're thinking about. Most of the clients that I work with, they come in with very fragmented memories of the abuse. Sometimes they don't really have many memories at all. And as we start to do the therapeutic work, and they are able to connect with their body more and connect with their feelings more, then they're able to start recounting more and more of the abuse. But before doing that therapeutic work, there's not a lot of awareness as to the experiences with the abuse, what that was like, how it affected them. Actually, what I hear from most of my clients is, Dr. Ashley, how is it possible that this is still affecting me? That happened to me 40 years ago. How on earth could it still be affecting me? I don't think about it. I don't talk about it. It doesn't even really bother me. And that can absolutely be true. And at the same time, it can still be affecting you on that subconscious level that you're not really aware of. So, part of the work that we do in therapy is we help people kind of bring that subconscious material from their past into their conscious awareness, where they really can start to see how the shame and the dissociation they experienced as a child to protect them and save them from experiencing the abuse is actually the very thing that is then driving the binge eating disorder and driving so much of their current shame and self-hatred and self-loathing. And once those connections are made, it's incredibly powerful for an adult because now you actually can start to change how the past affects you. And this is super, super empowering. And this is the best part of the therapeutic process. This is also why here at the Healthy Way Out, we can say with 100% confidence that freedom from food is absolutely possible, because the freedom comes not in finding the next diet. That's actually going to make things worse. The freedom comes in really kind of unlocking how past experiences are affecting you today, and then being able to effectively and consciously change them. So that's where people get empowered, and that's where the real, lasting, sustainable change happens. Okay, so that wraps up today's conversation about the connection between early childhood sexual abuse and the later development of binge eating disorder. What you experienced as a child continues to show up in a different form as an adult. So I'm hoping that these dots are getting connected and that they're making sense for you and your personal story. I will be back here next week for another deeper dive into this issue. We're going to talk about some very specific pieces related to your body, your emotions, and relationships. So definitely want to stay tuned. In the meantime, really give yourself some time and space to think about all of the different things that I've talked about today. Really let this material digest, if you will. I strongly recommend that people journal and give themselves a space to put words to what's going on for them. And please, if you have some emotionally safe people in your life, whether that's a friend, a partner, a sibling, a therapist, please share what's going on for you with them. A lot of our healing comes from sharing it with a safe person and putting language to what's happening inside of us. So if you can do those two things, I suspect you might actually feel a little better. Okay? All right. Have a fantastic week. I really look forward to seeing you back here next week. Take care. Bye-bye.